Picture this. You're standing in the Great Temple of Karnak in ancient Egypt in the year 1479 BC. The air is thick with incense and the sound of thousands of people cheering. Golden statues of gods tower above you, their eyes seeming to watch every move. This is supposed to be the happiest day in Egyptian history, a royal wedding that will secure the kingdom's future. The bride walks down the aisle wearing the finest silk and gold jewelry you've ever seen. She's beautiful, young, maybe 17 years old. Her skin glows in the torchlight, and flowers are woven into her long black hair. The crowd gasps at her beauty as she moves toward the altar. The groom waits for her, dressed in royal robes that cost more than most people will see in their entire lives. He's handsome, powerful, and everyone bows when he looks their way. This should be a perfect fairy tale wedding. But something feels horribly wrong. You notice people in the crowd whispering behind their hands. Some look uncomfortable. Others seem scared. A few are actually crying but trying to hide their tears. Why would people be upset at such a beautiful ceremony? Then you hear it. A whisper that makes your blood run cold. The pharaoh is marrying his sister. Your stomach drops. You look around, hoping you heard wrong. But the faces in the crowd confirm your worst fears. Everyone knows. Everyone sees what's happening. And everyone is too terrified to say a word. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a nightmare disguised as a celebration. The man about to become the most powerful person in Egypt has chosen his own sister as his bride. Not because he loves her. Not because it's politically smart. But because he can. Because no one in the entire kingdom has the power to tell a pharaoh no. What you're witnessing isn't just a wedding. It's the ultimate display of absolute power corrupted beyond recognition. A man so convinced of his own godhood that he believes normal human laws don't apply to him. A king who will destroy his own family to prove that he can do whatever he wants. The young woman walking toward the altar isn't a willing bride. She's a victim. And her brother isn't a loving groom. He's a monster who has spent years grooming her for this moment, using religion, family bonds, and royal authority to trap her in a situation no human being should ever face. This is the story of how absolute power turned a brother into a predator and a sister into a prisoner in her own palace. Before we dive into this forgotten story of power and family destruction, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I find it amazing that we're exploring these dark chapters of history together from different parts of the world, united by our need to understand how power corrupts. To understand just how shocking this story really is, you need to know what life was like for pharaohs in ancient Egypt. These weren't just kings. They were considered living gods walking among humans. From birth, they were told they had divine blood flowing through their veins. They believed they could speak directly to the gods and that their word was literally sacred law. This created a dangerous situation where pharaohs lived in a completely different reality than everyone else. While ordinary Egyptians faced strict moral rules and harsh punishments for breaking them, pharaohs operated under their own system where anything they did was automatically considered holy and right. Egyptian society was built on the idea that questioning a pharaoh was the same as questioning the gods themselves. This meant that even when pharaohs did horrible things, no one could speak up without risking not just their lives, but their eternal souls according to Egyptian beliefs. The royal family lived in isolated palaces surrounded by people whose jobs depended entirely on keeping the pharaoh happy. Everyone from servants to high priests knew that their survival meant agreeing with whatever the pharaoh wanted, no matter how twisted or wrong it seemed. This system created the perfect environment for abuse to flourish in secret. When you combine unlimited power with religious justification and complete isolation from normal moral rules, you get a recipe for the kind of evil we're about to explore. The man behind this evil act wasn't born a monster. Prince Thutmose started life as what everyone considered a perfect royal child. Born around 1500 BC to Pharaoh Thutmose II, he had everything going for him. His father was one of Egypt's most successful rulers, and his mother came from a powerful noble family known for their intelligence and beauty. As a little boy, Thutmose was charming and smart. His tutors said he learned faster than any prince they had ever taught. He could read hieroglyphs before most kids learned to walk properly. He understood mathematics, astronomy, and military strategy by the age of 10. Palace records show that visiting foreign ambassadors were amazed by his intelligence and natural leadership abilities. Everyone who met young Thutmose loved him immediately. He had this natural charm that made people want to please him and be around him. Servants described him as polite and kind. Other royal families across the ancient world sent gifts hoping to arrange marriages between their daughters and this promising prince. The priests praised him as the perfect example of divine royal blood. They said the gods had blessed Egypt with a future pharaoh who would bring glory and prosperity to the kingdom. His father had huge dreams for his son, planning for him to expand Egypt's territory and become the greatest pharaoh in history. But something started to change when Thutmose hit his teenage years. The problem was that nobody ever told him no. When you're raised being told you're a living god, and everyone around you treats you like you're perfect and can do no wrong, it does something terrible to your brain. Thutmose started to believe he really was above normal human rules and morality. At first, it was small things. He would skip his lessons and no one dared punish him. He would be cruel to servants and his parents would excuse it as royal spirit. He started making demands that seemed unreasonable, but everyone rushed to fulfill them because contradicting a future pharaoh was unthinkable. Then he discovered the power his royal status gave him over women. Palace servants' daughters couldn't refuse his advances. Noble families offered their daughters to him hoping for political favor. He began to see women not as people with their own thoughts and feelings, but as objects that existed for his pleasure and amusement. Each success made him bolder. Each person who bowed to his will convinced him that normal rules really didn't apply to him. He stopped seeing other people as equals and started viewing them as tools to be used for his entertainment and satisfaction. But the most dangerous change was how he started looking at his own family. Thutmose had a younger sister named Hatshepsut who was known for her beauty and intelligence. As she grew from a child into a young woman, something sick and twisted started growing in Thutmose's mind. He began to see her not as his sister, but as another possession that belonged to him by divine right. And that's when a promising young prince completed his transformation into a monster who would destroy his own family to feed his corrupted ego. What makes Thutmose's story so disturbing isn't just what he did, but how carefully he planned it. This wasn't a sudden decision or moment of passion. He spent years systematically grooming his own sister, using every advantage he had as her older brother and future pharaoh to trap her in a situation no human being should ever face. Hatshepsut was about 5 years younger than Thutmose, born when he was already showing signs of the intelligence and charm that made everyone love him. As a little girl, she worshipped her big brother. He was everything she aspired to be: smart, powerful, beloved by everyone in the palace. She followed him around like a devoted puppy, hanging on his every word. Thutmose understood this devotion and began using it against her when she was still a child. He started with small boundary violations that seemed innocent to outside observers but were actually calculated steps in a long-term plan of psychological manipulation. He would insist that Hatshepsut spend all her free time with him instead of with other children her age. He convinced their parents that as future pharaoh, he needed to mentor his sister in royal duties. This isolated her from normal relationships and made him the center of her entire world. As Hatshepsut grew older, Thutmose began introducing ideas that were designed to confuse her understanding of normal family relationships. He would tell her that royal siblings were different from ordinary people, that they had special bonds that others couldn't understand. He used Egyptian religious beliefs about divine royal blood to convince her that their relationship was blessed by the gods. He started giving her special attention and gifts that made her feel chosen and important. While other royal children received standard education, Thutmose arranged for Hatshepsut to have private lessons with him. He taught her things that were normally reserved for future pharaohs, making her feel special and privileged. But the most insidious part of his manipulation was how he gradually normalized physical contact that crossed appropriate boundaries. It started with longer hugs, then sitting too close during lessons, then casual touches that lingered longer than they should. Each step was small enough that Hatshepsut didn't recognize the pattern, but together they were breaking down her natural defenses. Thutmose also used his authority as future pharaoh to control every aspect of Hatshepsut's life. He decided who she could talk to, what activities she could participate in, even what clothes she wore. He convinced their parents that this was necessary preparation for her future role as a royal princess, but really he was isolating her and making her completely dependent on his approval. When Hatshepsut reached her early teens, Thutmose began using religious manipulation to justify increasingly inappropriate behavior. He told her that the gods communicated through him, and that questioning his decisions was the same as questioning divine will. He used her deep religious faith as a weapon against her own instincts. He created a twisted version of Egyptian religious beliefs that painted their special relationship as holy and necessary for the kingdom's survival. He told her that their divine royal blood meant they were meant to be together in ways that ordinary siblings could never understand. The most heartbreaking part of his manipulation was how he used Hatshepsut's love for Egypt against her. He convinced her that their union was necessary to maintain the royal bloodline and keep the gods' favor. He made her believe that refusing him would bring disaster to the entire kingdom and doom millions of innocent people. By the time Hatshepsut was old enough to understand what was really happening, she was completely trapped. Years of psychological manipulation had destroyed her ability to recognize that what he was proposing was wrong. She had been isolated from anyone who might help her, convinced that resistance was both impossible and evil. Thutmose had turned his sister's love, faith, and loyalty into chains that bound her to his twisted will. And no one in the entire kingdom had the power or courage to break those chains. What made Thutmose's abuse even more evil was how he twisted Egyptian religious beliefs to justify his sick desires. He didn't just abuse his sister, he convinced an entire kingdom that his actions were holy and blessed by the gods themselves. Ancient Egyptians believed that pharaohs were living gods on earth, descended from Ra, the sun god. This gave pharaohs enormous religious authority, but it was never meant to justify the kind of behavior Thutmose was planning. He took these beliefs and corrupted them to serve his own twisted purposes. Thutmose began spreading the idea that royal blood was so divine that it could only be preserved through marriage within the royal family. He claimed that the gods had revealed to him in dreams that mixing royal blood with commoner blood would weaken Egypt's divine protection and bring disaster to the kingdom. This wasn't traditional Egyptian belief. While some pharaohs had married within their families for political reasons, it was never considered religiously required or spiritually pure. But Thutmose was smart enough to present his twisted interpretation gradually, using his authority as future pharaoh to make it seem like divine revelation. He started by convincing the high priests, the most powerful religious authorities in Egypt. These men depended on royal favor for their positions and wealth. When the future pharaoh claimed to have received divine messages about royal bloodlines, they faced an impossible choice: challenge a living god and lose everything, or go along with teachings that felt wrong but came from someone they were taught never to question. One by one, the priests found ways to rationalize Thutmose's claims. They pointed to stories of gods who married their siblings in Egyptian mythology. They argued that pharaohs were so far above ordinary humans that normal moral rules didn't apply to them. They convinced themselves that questioning divine revelation was a greater sin than whatever doubts they might have about royal sibling marriage. Thutmose also used Egypt's complex religious hierarchy to silence opposition. When lower-ranking priests expressed concerns, they were told that only the highest religious authorities could understand such divine mysteries. When nobles questioned the theological basis for his claims, they were accused of lacking sufficient faith in the gods. The most disturbing part was how Thutmose used religious fear to control people's reactions. He claimed that anyone who opposed this divine union would bring the gods' wrath down on all of Egypt. He painted resistance as not just treason against the pharaoh, but as blasphemy that could doom the entire kingdom to plagues, famines, and invasions. He created elaborate ceremonies and rituals around his planned marriage to Hatshepsut, making it seem like the most important religious event in Egyptian history. He commissioned new prayers, hymns, and religious artwork that portrayed sibling marriage as the highest form of divine love and royal duty. Even people who felt sick about what was happening found themselves participating in the religious justifications. The alternative, standing up to a pharaoh and risking not just their lives but their eternal souls according to Egyptian beliefs, was too terrifying for most people to contemplate. Thutmose had weaponized religion itself, turning the very beliefs that were supposed to provide moral guidance into tools for justifying the most immoral acts imaginable. He had convinced an entire civilization that evil was holy, that abuse was love, and that resistance to his will was resistance to the gods themselves. By the time anyone realized how completely he had corrupted their religious understanding, it was too late to stop what he had set in motion. Behind all the religious justifications and political power games was a real person suffering in ways that are almost impossible to imagine. Hatshepsut wasn't just a royal princess or a symbol of divine bloodlines. She was a young woman whose childhood, innocence, and entire life were stolen by the person who was supposed to protect her most. As a little girl, Hatshepsut had been everything you'd want in a royal daughter. Palace records describe her as intelligent, curious, and kind. She loved learning about Egyptian history and dreamed of someday helping her brother rule Egypt wisely and justly. She was particularly drawn to stories of great queens who had helped their kingdoms prosper, and she hoped to follow in their footsteps. She was also deeply religious, spending hours in prayer and showing genuine care for the common people of Egypt. Servants remembered her as the royal child who always asked about their families and tried to help when she learned someone was sick or struggling. She had a natural empathy that should have made her a beloved queen someday. But as Thutmose's manipulation intensified, people began to notice changes in Hatshepsut's personality. The bright, confident girl gradually became withdrawn and anxious. She stopped participating in activities she had once loved. Her laughter became rare, and when she did smile, it seemed forced and empty. The isolation Thutmose imposed on her was particularly cruel. Hatshepsut had once been close to other young women in the palace, daughters of nobles who served as her companions and friends. But as Thutmose tightened his control, these friendships were systematically destroyed. He convinced their parents that their daughters were distracting Hatshepsut from her royal duties. Without friends her own age, Hatshepsut became completely dependent on Thutmose for social interaction and emotional support. This dependency was exactly what he wanted. It made his manipulation easier and resistance harder. She had no one to talk to about her growing discomfort with his behavior, no one to tell her that what was happening wasn't normal or acceptable. The psychological pressure was enormous. Hatshepsut was trapped between her natural instincts telling her something was wrong and the constant messaging from everyone around her that questioning Thutmose was questioning the gods themselves. This created a mental torture that ate away at her sense of reality and self-worth. Palace servants later reported seeing Hatshepsut crying alone in her chambers, but when they asked what was wrong, she would claim she was fine or make up excuses about being tired or worried about kingdom affairs. She had been so thoroughly conditioned to protect Thutmose's image that she couldn't even seek help from people who might have cared about her. As the planned marriage approached, Hatshepsut's distress became more obvious. She lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and developed nervous habits like constantly fidgeting with her jewelry or hair. Several times, servants found her staring out windows for hours, seeming to be somewhere else entirely in her mind. The most heartbreaking part was how she tried to find ways to escape without directly defying Thutmose. She asked her tutors about distant lands where Egyptian princesses might be needed for diplomatic marriages. She inquired about religious orders where royal women could serve the gods. She even suggested that she might be more useful to Egypt as an advisor rather than a wife. Each attempt at finding alternatives was gently but firmly shut down. Every door that might have led to freedom was closed by people who believed they were serving Egypt's divine interests. The entire palace system that should have protected her instead became a prison with no exit. Perhaps most tragically, Hatshepsut began to believe that her suffering was necessary and even noble. Thutmose's religious manipulation had convinced her that accepting this fate was her divine duty to Egypt. She started to see her own pain as a sacrifice she owed to her people and her gods. In her private prayers, she asked the gods for strength to endure rather than deliverance from her situation. She had been so completely broken down that she couldn't even imagine that the gods might want something different for her life. By the time the wedding preparations began, Hatshepsut had become a ghost of her former self, a young woman so thoroughly destroyed by years of systematic abuse that she could no longer remember who she had been before her brother decided to possess her completely. The vibrant, intelligent, caring girl who had once dreamed of helping Egypt prosper had been replaced by a hollow shell going through the motions of life while dying inside. The royal wedding between Thutmose and Hatshepsut took place in 1479 BC, and it became one of the most disturbing events in ancient Egyptian history. What should have been impossible became reality through the sheer force of absolute power and religious manipulation. The preparations took months and involved thousands of people across Egypt. Thutmose spared no expense, treating this as the most important event of his reign. He commissioned new temple decorations, ordered special ceremonial clothing made from the finest materials, and planned celebrations that would last for weeks. But beneath all the golden decorations and elaborate ceremonies, everyone involved knew they were participating in something fundamentally wrong. The evidence of widespread discomfort comes from ancient records that survived, letters between nobles expressing private concerns, diary entries from priests struggling with their consciences, and official documents that show unusual levels of security and control around the event. Foreign ambassadors who attended left detailed accounts of the ceremony, and their writings reveal how shocked the outside world was by what they witnessed. Representatives from Mesopotamia, Nubia, and the Mediterranean kingdoms had never seen anything like this. Some diplomatic records suggest that certain kingdoms reconsidered their relationships with Egypt after witnessing what they considered an abomination. The ceremony itself took place in the Great Temple of Karnak, the most sacred location in Egypt. Thutmose had chosen this venue deliberately. It was impossible to question the holiness of anything that happened in Karnak without committing sacrilege. The temple was decorated with new artwork depicting sibling gods in loving embraces, creating visual propaganda for what was about to happen. Thousands of people attended, but the atmosphere was unlike any normal royal wedding. Instead of joy and celebration, Observers described a sense of fear and forced compliance. People participated because they had to, not because they wanted to. The usual sounds of genuine celebration, spontaneous cheering, laughter, excited conversations were replaced by careful, rehearsed responses. Hatshepsut herself was described by witnesses as looking more like a sacrifice than a bride. She was beautiful in her ceremonial dress and golden jewelry, but her face was pale and her movements seemed mechanical. Several observers noted that she never smiled during the entire ceremony and seemed to be staring at something far away that no one else could see. The religious ceremony was conducted by high priests who had been carefully selected for their loyalty to Thutmose rather than their theological wisdom. They performed rituals that had been specially created for this occasion, blending traditional marriage ceremonies with religious language that portrayed the union as divinely commanded rather than personally chosen. What made the event even more disturbing was how Thutmose behaved throughout the ceremony. Witnesses described him as radiating satisfaction and triumph, like someone who had just won a great victory. He played the role of loving groom perfectly, but observers noted something cold and possessive in his manner that felt more like ownership than affection. The wedding feast that followed was equally unsettling. While guests ate expensive food and drank fine wine, conversations were stilted and uncomfortable. People spoke in careful, measured tones, afraid to say anything that might be interpreted as criticism or disapproval. The normal joy and relaxation of a wedding celebration was replaced by the tension of people walking on eggshells. Several ancient sources mention that some guests left early, claiming illness or urgent business elsewhere. Others stayed but participated minimally, doing only what was absolutely required by protocol. The celebration that was supposed to mark a joyous beginning felt more like a funeral for everything that had been destroyed to make this moment possible. By the end of the day, Thutmose had achieved his goal. He had publicly claimed his sister as his wife, forced an entire kingdom to witness and validate his actions, and established his power to do absolutely anything without consequences. But the cost was enormous, not just to Hatshepsut, but to the moral foundation of Egyptian society itself. The immediate aftermath of the royal wedding revealed something deeply disturbing about how power can corrupt an entire society. Instead of outrage or resistance, Egypt responded with terrified silence and forced acceptance that enabled even greater abuses to continue. The official response was carefully orchestrated celebration. Palace scribes recorded the wedding as a glorious event that brought divine blessing to Egypt. Court poets wrote verses praising the union as proof of the gods' favor. Official art depicted the royal couple as perfect examples of divine love and royal duty. But private reactions told a completely different story. Letters between noble families that survived from this period reveal widespread horror and disgust that people couldn't express publicly. One nobleman wrote to his brother that, "The gods weep for what we have become," while carefully avoiding any direct criticism that could be traced back to him. Religious leaders found themselves in an impossible position. Many privately believed that what they had witnessed violated everything they understood about divine will and moral law. But they had been so thoroughly convinced that questioning the pharaoh meant questioning the gods themselves that they couldn't speak up without destroying their own religious worldview. Some priests began leaving Egypt entirely, claiming they needed to serve in distant temples or study religious texts in other lands. Archaeological evidence suggests that several religious communities in remote areas of Egypt stopped participating in official ceremonies and festivals around this time, essentially going into passive resistance. The common people of Egypt were perhaps the most honest in their reactions, but also the most powerless to do anything about them. Folk songs and stories from this period that were preserved in later writings include subtle references to cursed unions and kings who angered the gods. These cultural expressions allowed people to voice their feelings indirectly without risking punishment. Foreign kingdoms reacted with a mixture of shock and political calculation. Some distanced themselves from Egypt diplomatically, while others saw an opportunity to gain advantage over what they viewed as a weakened and morally compromised rival. Trade relationships shifted as some nations became reluctant to deal closely with what they considered a cursed regime. The most disturbing aspect was how quickly society adapted to the new normal. Within a few years, people had learned not to think too deeply about the royal marriage. It became one of those things that everyone knew but no one discussed, like a family secret that poisons everything but can never be acknowledged. This social silence created a dangerous precedent that enabled further abuses. When people learned to accept the unacceptable, when they trained themselves not to trust their own moral instincts, they became complicit in a system that could justify any horror in the name of divine authority. The legal system completely failed to provide any protection or accountability. There were no trials, no investigations, no official recognition that anything wrong had occurred. The institutions that should have safeguarded justice instead became tools for enforcing compliance with evil. Most tragically, the people who might have helped Hatshepsut, her former friends, sympathetic servants, caring relatives, found themselves unable to act because the entire social structure had been weaponized against resistance. Speaking up meant facing not just legal punishment, but social ostracism and spiritual condemnation. Egypt had become a kingdom where evil was called good, and good people were silenced by their own fear. If you think this ancient Egyptian horror story is just a relic of the past, you're wrong. The same patterns that enabled Thutmose's abuse are happening right now in 2025, just with different methods and modern technology. Powerful people still use their authority to abuse family members, and they still use religious, cultural, or institutional justifications to silence their victims and avoid consequences. The tools have changed, but the basic power dynamics remain exactly the same. Look at modern cases of wealthy families where abuse happens behind closed doors. Rich parents who abuse their children often use their financial power, social connections, and legal resources to maintain control and silence. Just like ancient Egypt, money and status create protective barriers that keep victims trapped and outsiders from intervening. Religious communities today still sometimes enable family abuse by teaching that questioning authority figures is questioning God. Some churches, mosques, and other religious organizations have covered up cases where leaders or prominent families committed horrible acts against their own relatives, using religious language to shame victims into silence. The divine right justification has been replaced by modern versions like family privacy, cultural traditions, or therapeutic treatment. Abusive family members still find ways to make their victims believe that suffering in silence is somehow noble, necessary, or divinely required. Technology has made documentation and control easier, not harder. Abusive family members today use phones, cameras, social media, and financial tracking to monitor and control their victims just as thoroughly as ancient pharaohs controlled their palaces. GPS tracking, hidden cameras, and digital surveillance create new forms of the isolation that made Hatshepsut so helpless. The social silence that protected Thutmose still exists today. People who suspect family abuse often don't speak up because they don't want to get involved. They're afraid of powerful families' lawyers, or they convince themselves it's not their business. This creates the same environment of enabling silence that allowed ancient horrors to continue. Legal systems still favor wealth and power over justice. Rich families can hire expensive lawyers, influence investigations, and use their connections to avoid consequences. Poor victims often can't access the legal help they need, while wealthy abusers can drag out court cases until victims give up or run out of resources. The institutional failures are also identical. Schools, hospitals, social services, and religious organizations that should protect victims often prioritize their relationships with powerful families over the safety of abuse victims. They'd rather avoid controversy than confront uncomfortable truths. Historical records from Thutmose's time come from Egyptian palace archives, foreign diplomatic correspondence, religious texts that survived, and archaeological evidence of social changes during his reign. These sources confirm that the patterns we see today, institutional protection of abusers, victim silencing, social complicity, and abuse of religious authority, have been consistent across thousands of years. The methods evolve, but human nature and power structures remain depressingly unchanged. That's why understanding historical abuse helps us recognize and fight modern versions of the same evil. Today, we remember Hatshepsut not as the willing bride in some ancient royal ceremony, but as what she really was, a young woman whose entire life was stolen by someone who was supposed to protect her. She deserved to live freely, to choose her own path, to experience real love and happiness instead of being trapped in a nightmare disguised as divine will. Hatshepsut was more than just a victim. She was a human being with dreams, intelligence, and potential that were crushed by her brother's evil selfishness. She could have been a great queen who helped Egypt prosper. Instead, she became a prisoner in her own palace, forced to smile while dying inside. What Thutmose did wasn't love, marriage, or religious duty. It was systematic destruction of another human being's soul, justified by twisted interpretations of divine authority. He used every advantage he had, his position, religious beliefs, family bonds, and social power, to trap his sister in a situation no person should ever face. But Thutmose wasn't the only monster in this story. Egyptian society as a whole failed Hatshepsut completely. The priests who should have protected the innocent instead provided religious cover for evil. The nobles who should have spoken up for justice instead protected their own positions. The legal system that should have provided safety instead became a tool of oppression. This story teaches us crucial lessons that apply just as much today. Authority figures who claim divine or institutional backing for their actions should be questioned, not blindly obeyed. Religious or cultural justifications for abuse are still abuse, no matter how they're dressed up. And silence in the face of evil makes everyone complicit in the suffering that follows. We live in a world where powerful people still abuse family members and use their authority to escape consequences. Where institutions still protect abusers while abandoning victims. Where people still look the other way when confronting evil might cost them something. But we can choose to do better. We can believe victims when they speak up. We can question authority figures who demand blind obedience. We can refuse to accept religious or cultural excuses for abuse. We can insist that power comes with responsibility, not immunity from moral law. Hatshepsut never got justice in her lifetime. She died young, probably from the psychological and physical toll of years of abuse, still trapped in the nightmare her brother had created for her. But her story can still serve justice if we learn from it. If we recognize the warning signs. If we refuse to let history repeat itself. That's the only justice we can give her now, and it's the least we owe her memory.